Okay, so why don't we get started? My name is Mikhail TROITSKIY, and I teach here at MGIMO, and it gives me great pleasure to moderate this panel of distinguished academics today looking at counterterrorism and non-state threats. And you, of course, have the substantive questions that we put before our panelists in this session, and I would urge our panelists to address the questions that we have prepared in order to align our presentations. Now, I suggest every panelist has up to 10 minutes max to deliver remarks, and then we open it up for Q&A. Now, Professor Monica Duffy-Toft is going to talk first, and I'll briefly introduce every speaker before she or he takes the floor. Now, Monica Toft is a professor of international politics and director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School. Before joining Fletcher, she taught at Oxford and Harvard universities, and at Harvard she also directed the Initiative on Religion in International Affairs and was the assistant director of the John Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. She was educated at the University of Chicago and the University of California at Santa Barbara. Prior to this, she spent 4 years in the United States Army as a Russian linguist. And Professor Toft's areas of research include international security, ethnic and religious violence, civil wars, and demography. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so actually, is it good morning? Yeah, it's 11:40. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Andre, for such a terrific conference. So I have some slides, and I'm going to run through fairly quickly. But the three main takeaways is that I still think we had this conference in November, and I was looking at my notes from my panel, and actually Irina and I were on the panel together. And the three main takeaways are largely the same, which is basically, I think, U.S.-Russia relations remain zero-sum, which is it's just a real shame. And at the time, I said something controversial, but I think it's true that U.S.-Russian relations are premised on sort of hurting each other, and in particular, Russia sort of trying to stick it to the United States and giving priority to undermining what the United States might be doing in some circles. And I'd be interested in Ivan and Irina's perspective on that. And then in the Middle East, I'm going to talk a bit about Syria and Iraq, that Russia has established itself as a serious counterweight to U.S. interests there. So we all know about Syria. It's an ongoing civil war. It's been going on for 8 years, and it's involved a multitude of different actors. So I'm going to go through the origins, the overview of the conflict. Then in relation to other civil wars, I'm a student of religious civil wars, and Syria is a particularly brutal and nasty one. And then what's happening now, where might we go next, and how do we move on, both the U.S. and Russia. So, as I mentioned, it's in its 8th year. It's based on divisions within the society, not only class divisions. You could make the case under Assad. There was a real pressure on Assad to remedy the economy, and rather than open up the economy, he repressed it. But there's also religious differences. He's part of a clan that is of the Alawite branch of Islam. It's a minority in the region. There's resentment that a minority is governing the country. And as you know, the conflict started as a result of uprisings in Dara after some students had been, some children actually had been arrested and detained, and evidence of torture. They happened to be very well connected families politically, and this led to uprisings that then spread throughout the country and then eventually into civil war. As you know, it's led to a humanitarian and strategic crisis that continues today, and given what we know know about civil wars, particularly ones that have become internationalized in the way that this one has, it's unlikely to end anytime soon. And here, this is just 3 different graphics. You don't have to see them just to give you a sense, see them in detail, just to give you a sense of how complicated the war is. And you can see there is a common enemy, and the United States and the Russian Federation are united with most of the rest of the world in defeating ISIS or IS. But you can see that different entities, the United States, the Gulf states, and coalition are on one side, Russia, Iran are on another, which makes it extraordinarily complicated for dealing with the conflict. The major factions, again, hundreds of thousands involved in the fighting. It's declined, obviously, with the defeat of ISIS, which is now in just a number of small strongholds. Estimates are up from a high of 45,000 IS troops. We're down to 1,000 to 2,000. Most of them have been fleeing to Turkey, but also tragically, and I think harrowingly at this point, to Yemen, and also to Libya, and then to Africa. So one of the questions we had to address is how likely is this to metastasize or spread? And I think with its defeat in Syria and Iraq, we are seeing it spread. And estimates you guys probably know better. This is what I was able to find: 4,000 Russian troops and about 2,000 American troops. You can look at the nationalities of the different fighters. Again, Russia is represented. The United States, very, very few fighters, in part because it's more difficult for Americans to actually get to the place, but there have been some. And so a big question for all of us sitting in the room is what to do and how to repatriate these fighters. The United States has been quite strict. They're seen as war criminals. Russia seems to be a little bit more gentle in the sense that they're allowing children, and I understand mothers of the children to return to Russia, but the question is what to do with the hardcore fighters when they want to return. Europe has been quite strict, actually, in repatriating these fighters. The toll, hundreds of thousands of dead. This is really a wild card estimate. Most people do not know how many. The Syrian Observatory Group is considered one of the more reliable, but hundreds of thousands dead, and we probably will not know until we can go into the country more fully and after it's completely emancipated. And you can see an estimated 100,000 that we suspect. These are the known unknowns, but even that's sort of a wild guess. Of a population of 22 million, almost half of them are either refugees or IDPs, internally displaced persons, or refugees living in the region, which again is destabilizing. So from a U.S.-Russian perspective, this is not good news because it costs a lot of money for these governments, many of whom do not have the resources. Turkey, Jordan are bearing the brunt of this. And if you look at it per capita, they have huge numbers of refugees. And then within Syria and Iraq, large numbers of internally displaced people who don't have the resources to take care of themselves and their families. So, there had, as I mentioned, the zero sum in 2015 when the airstrike started with both sides in the United States and with Russia. You can see that they had different target sets. The United States was absolutely committed to routing out IS, so they were going and attacking in the West, whereas Russia still and remains committed to keeping Assad in power. It's something anathema to the United States. It's a big point of disagreement, although I think in some ways the United States is coming around, realizing that we do need stability. There isn't an alternative at this point to Assad. So you can see Russia's strikes were largely in the West, trying to rout out sort of opposition there. The United States was largely in the East, going after IS, targeting. The United States has continued its strikes through December 2017, but they really diminished quite a bit, and I'll show next. But you can see the United States has largely been in the West trying to rout out, and again, Russia's been on the eastern part where Assad had more control, but the opposition was active against him. And here, I don't have the Russian strikes, but these are American strikes. And you can see the bulk of it was this period of last year, which really led to the routing of ISIS. And it's diminished over time. And unfortunately, we're seeing the uptick in, of course, Yemen. As ISIS goes there. And I think that the war is regionalizing. And you can see ISIS has been, since 2015, it's lost a lot of control of the territory. It used to have something like 17,000 square miles. It's down to 2,000 square miles of control, which is still a lot, but it's largely in the desert area in eastern Syria and western Iraq, which is largely desert. Most people don't want it anyway. And again, this is giving you a sense of just who's the lines of control in the conflict, and this is as of the end of March, and it hasn't shifted that much since. So, like I said, this is a regional war. One of the things, another takeaway of this is until the local balance of power, the regional balance of power, and the global balance of power, particularly between the United States and Russia, is resolved, this conflict is not going to be resolved. And there's an overlay. I'm a student of religion and civil wars. There is an overlay of religion in the sense that if I go back to that very complicated spaghetti slide of the different alliances and coalitions, there's roughly a Sunni-Shia split, where you've got the Saudis and the Gulf states aligned one side to sort of fight against Assad and company, and then on the other side you have Iran, but also backed by Russia. And so you do see this sort of playing out where you have majority Shia and majority Sunni states roughly aligned. Now, some of those cases, they're alliances of convenience, but generally speaking, it is holding still. One of the questions we had to ask and answer for this panel is it likely to spread? And the answer is yes. We are seeing ISIS and, to some extent, Al-Qaeda having more influence globally. So the Philippines, Bangladesh, some people are quite nervous about Malaysia today. And then, of course, we can talk about Africa, Niger. The Americans lost 4 special operators in Niger, but also Mali, Libya, and like I said, keep an eye on Yemen. Yemen is not going anywhere anytime soon. In some ways, it's more of a catastrophe, than is Syria, because it's on the brink of a famine, a major famine. So if you look at civil wars, this is my data. It's coming out this year. This is to December 2014. We have seen religious civil wars as a kind of civil war where the combatants abide by religious tenets or they abide by different beliefs based on religion. Have seen an uptick since the 2000s as a proportion of wars. And why this is worrisome, as a scholar and analyst, they tend to last longer. They're harder to negotiate. So Diana was telling us about, she's an expert in negotiations, and religious civil wars, they're hard. And once you get them negotiated, even if you can, they're more likely to break down. They're more deadly to civilians, so 2.5 times more civilians die in religiously inspired civil wars. And once they become religious, the religion tends to intensify as the war continues. And I talk about this as being the ratchet effect. So it's not good news because we're seeing religion having more and more influence in these kinds of conflicts. And if you look at the data, if you look at most ongoing civil wars today, there's about 24. They tend to involve Arab Muslim societies. And it's not anything intrinsic to Islam. It's because these are societies that are going through the democratization transition, trying to move from autocracies, you can think about the Arab Spring, to a more democratic. And these are the types of regimes that are the most prone to conflict. So it's not necessarily, and Islam is brought in, it's instrumentalized, it's brought in as part of the political rhetoric in these fights. So where do we go from here? I don't know. I mean, it's really, this is a complex stew of interests, competing values, not only between the U.S. And the Russian Federation, but across its allies. We tried to let it burn, particularly under the Obama administration. Trump came in and he was going to try to do that, but as we saw, we've now done missile strikes as a result of the chemical weapons use yet again. Large-scale intervention, I don't think we have the stomach for it, and I don't think the Russian Federation has the stomach for it. So do we work with Assad? I think Russia has done this since the get-go, and I think actually the United States is coming around to this idea, given that there's a multiplicity of different insurgents and fighters. There isn't a sense of who could take over from Assad. At a minimum, for the humanitarian crisis that's ongoing, commit to no-fly zones, controlling the airspace. I don't know how likely that's going to be, given that Assad is still absolutely committed and has Russia's backing. I'd be interested again in Irina and Ivan about that. I don't think that that's going to happen. Maybe it'll happen in the eastern part of the country, but probably not in the western. And I think we will continue the fight against IS and al-Qaeda with coalition allies. But the question is, to what end? At what point does it end? And as we push them out of Syria and Iraq, we're pushing them into Lebanon, Libya, to some extent maybe Lebanon as well, but into Libya, to Yemen, and then broader into Asia and South Asia. So I'm not optimistic that this is going to end any time soon, in part because the U.S. and the Russian Federation do not necessarily share the same sort of end game, what we're trying to achieve here, and the thwarting of what we're trying to achieve. The ratchet effect of religion is in play, and until we can sort of de-escalate religion in the region, which is not going to be possible, Russia and the United States are not part of the Muslim community. And then, like the local politics, we're going to have a multitude of ceasefires throughout the region in order to, it's not just one ceasefire between Assad and everybody else, it's a multitude. And then the regional dynamics, the power plays between Saudi Arabia and Iran that are playing out, and then of course at the global level, the dynamics that are happening there. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Toft. The next panelist to speak is Professor Irina ZVYAGELSKAYA, and she is a Chief Research Fellow at the Institute for Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences and a professor at MGIMO. She has made a distinguished career as a scholar and administrator at the Russian Academy of Sciences. She has published widely in Russian, English, German, and French on conflict resolution and other security issues in the Middle East and Central Asia. She was educated at Leningrad State University, and Professor ZVYAGELSKAYA has taught at the American University in Cairo, as well as a number of leading European and North American schools. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Well, I would like to come straight to the point of the discussion and to say that the counterterrorism in the Middle East has ceased to be a unifying factor, both for Russia and the United States, and not only, because if we look at Turkey, for example, we'll have differences in reading what the terrorist threat is. You know that Turkey believes that PID are terrorists because they are closely connected with PKK in Turkey. But anyway, the problem is that after the military defeat of ISIS, the question has become much more politicized than it was before. It was absolutely obvious that ISIS is a common threat. And I want to remind you that when Russia introduced its air force into Syria, the idea behind it was to fight together with the Western coalition against this common enemy, and probably in the course of such fighting to improve relations in general with the West, which were, as you know, very much spoiled by that time. So now, with ISIS practically gone, both in Iraq and Syria, the question is what kind of terrorist organizations we have to deal with. And as you know, terrorism is a method, first and foremost. And if so, we know that different organizations have used this method. For example, there were leftists and rightists, there were jihadists, and there were quite secular organizations. So when we are trying to determine whether this or that organization is a terrorist organization or can be labeled a terrorist organization, we have very vivid differences. And especially in the context of the Civil War, because in the Civil War, no one has been using vegetarian methods. So it's no wonder that several organizations, which can be labeled as oppositioners, as rebels, and so on, they are using absolutely disgusting methods, like Ahrar al-Sham or Jaish al-Islam, in Syria, though they were not on the United Nations terrorist list. And this is important because as for the ISIS, as for al-Nusra, they are on this list, and no one has been disputing whether they are terrorists or not. It's obvious they are. But as for these small organizations, which are very active actors in the Syrian civil war, here we have different points of view. And I would like to say that there is a certain consistency both in the United States policy towards these organizations and in the Russian policy towards these organizations. For example, you remember that the Western coalition was coined up with an idea of fighting terrorism and supporting opposition. So ISIS is gone, then the opposition should be supported. There is a consistency. But when we say that there is a different opposition and not all fractions and not all organizations should be supported, we are being told that you support Assad, he is no better, and so we are all in the same, I would say, in the same boat. I wouldn't say that Russia is very rigid and cannot change its policy when necessary concerning these Ahrar al-Sham or Jaish al-Islam organizations. For example, if you remember, Jaish al-Islam was delivered by Turkey to Astana meeting, and actually it was accepted because it decided that it should participate in negotiations. I wouldn't say that very much really happened, and its participation couldn't improve the situation, but still at the time we never labeled them as terrorists because they decided that the peace process is needed, is important, and so on and so forth. So when we are coming back to the question of non-state actors, non-state threats, I believe that we cannot say that all non-state actors are terrorists. The problem of non-state actors is that they are not bridled by any international agreements. They can act on their own, but at the same time, sometimes it's very difficult to find a certain distinction for some organizations. We say they are non-state, but if you take Hezbollah, for example, it's very difficult to state whether it's a state actor or non-state actor, since it has been playing very important role in the political life of Lebanon, and what's more, it has won the recent elections, so its positions will be even stronger. But at the same time, we used to label it as non-state actor. So there are other actors where this distinction is really very blurred. But what is important that Hezbollah, for example, came to Syria on its own. There was no mandate on the part of the Syrian government, which would have allowed it to fight on the Syrian soil. So these organizations, I just took Hezbollah as an example, there are others, I would say that these organizations are making life of the United States and Russia even more difficult in Syria. And the problem is that with the rise of regional powers, including states and non-state actors, the policy of Russia and the policy of the United States is really getting much more complicated because local actors, they are very much interested in taking advantage both of United States, other Western powers, and Russia. And they have their own agenda, which does not correspond with the interests of the global nations. So they are really trying to somehow suck in both powers into their internal struggle. And this is a dangerous situation because, as you know, it brings us even physically closer in Syria, as Monica has already shown us, that Russians are there and Americans are there, And by the way, I would say that no one is 100% sure that the Americans will evacuate either from Syria or from Iraq, despite all statements which we heard. And if they are not, it means that there is also always a counterbalance for the locals, just to use against Russia or use Russia against the United States, because, as I said, they have their own interests in mind. So I believe that the situation is really getting probably not better, unfortunately, despite the military defeat of the main terrorist organization, because there is no rules of the games. The only rule is deconfliction, which is mentioned here, and I believe that fortunately here, we continue our cooperation, and it is very important. It's very important. But at the same time, since our clients, I would say, are different, we are doomed to have certain misunderstanding, I hope only misunderstanding, or even certain tensions, both in Syria and to a certain extent in Iraq. So I'm not very optimistic in this respect. And but at the same time, and this is my wrapping up already, at the same time we all know that international terrorism is not over. Well, I am not discussing whether they all will come to Afghanistan or to Southeast Asia, because there is enough place for them in the Middle East. Quite enough. Some of them will probably go, but they can stay in Yemen, they can stay in Libya, they can stay in other states which are really very fragile right now. So we are doomed to fight them together. How are we going to do it? After positive and non-positive experience which we have, I don't know. But this is the main, this is still the common goal, which unfortunately is not bringing us closer together right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor ZVYAGELSKAYA. And the third panelist to speak is Professor Ivan Safranchuk, who is an associate professor at MGIMO and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy in Russia and an advisor to the President of the Diplomatic Academy of Kyrgyzstan. Ivan Safranchuk was educated at MGIMO and received his doctorate from the Russian Academy of Sciences. He worked on arms control projects at the Peer Center for Policy Studies in Moscow between 1997 and 2001. Between 2001 and 2007, he headed the Moscow office of the Washington-based think tank Center for Defense Information. And then from 2011 to 2014, Dr. Safranchuk served as deputy director at the Institute for Contemporary International Studies at the Russian Diplomatic Academy. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for this kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I want to skip many of details because my colleagues have already touched upon them. When I attend conferences devoted to certain conflicts in the Middle East or in other parts of the world, or conferences on terrorism, I'm always very impressed with many details which are debated by specialists, Russian or American. However, I always, at the same time, I'm a bit, at least a bit puzzled on what does it mean for broader political issues, for Russian-American relations and so on. And that's why from some of the details, I want to present a bit broader picture. What we see is that in the previous decade, Russia and the United States were partners, if not allies, in the war on terror. And that war on terror against global Islamist jihad was taken as a sort of new world war. World War III or something, 3.1 or 3.2, but that was something really uniting. In this decade, we see that terrorism is not gone. We have Islamist, jihadist movements in different parts of the world, but we don't have war on terror anymore. And moreover, when Putin and other Russian officials were openly saying, like, let us have a new big war on terror, the answer from the United States was the United States are ready to engage in some tactical cooperation, but not have a new big war on terror. And I'm trying to explain why so. And then, from what we know about jihadist movements and conflicts with the involvement of jihadist movements, we may draw a few things we know by now. First, we should keep in mind that we, in the last nearly 40 years, since the end of the 70s, we've always had in the world at least one, sometimes two conflicts where jihadist movements were part of a conflict. In the 80s, this was war in Afghanistan. In the 90s, this was war in Chechnya and partly in the Balkans. In the 2000 years, this was Iraq and Afghanistan. And in 2010s, this is partly Iraq, partly Afghanistan, plus Syria became the major jihadist front. So for nearly 40 years, without a single year of interruption, we always have at least one or two regional conflicts where jihadists are side of a conflict. Second, we know that there is a professional core of the jihadist world movement. In numerical terms, this jihadist core is evaluated differently by different experts, but the range is between 10, 15, or 20,000 professional fighters. So between 10 and 20,000 professional fighters who actually are not linked to any particular localities, and they can shift between conflicts depending where sponsors and ideologists of jihadist movements declare a new major jihad to happen. But this is in numerical terms about this jihadist core. At the same time, we know that casualties in this jihadist core are very high in each conflict where they are engaged. Probably in each conflict they lose more than half of this professional core. And then the question is how it reemerges. And here the point 3 comes, which we know. And this point 3 is that in each jihadist conflict, there is not only professional core mentioned in the previous item engaged, but also there is wider recruitment for the major jihadist war from various conflicts existing in the wide Muslim territory between the Pacific Ocean in the north of Africa and between the Atlantic Ocean in the north of Africa and the Pacific Ocean on the other side of the continent. There are thousands and thousands of conflicts in thousands of Muslim states which are not very much covered by the international media. There are internal tensions. And in all these internal conflicts and tensions, there are people who are fighting local governments, who are making local insurgencies, and they are recruited to the major jihadist war to support the professional corps. And this wider recruitment potential is very difficult to evaluate. But but at least we can say that these are thousands, maybe up to 50,000, 60,000 people who can be recruited from various local tensions in the Muslim world to the major jihadist war. And then in each conflict, some of these people recruited to the major jihadist war join the professional jihadist corps, which experiences a lot of casualties in each conflict. Then point number 4 is that jihadist fighters in each conflict with the jihadist involvement, they actually fight very bravely, and they are good fighters, but at the same time they do not fight hopeless wars. If they see that the local government is either alone or with a support of a foreign ally really resists the jihadist war, they prefer to wrap up the conflict and escape to another territory. But at the same time, if they see local vulnerabilities, if they see vulnerabilities of a local government, they exploit it up to the maximum. And then point 5, that is something about which we do not know very much, and that is a very politically controversial issue. That is the point about sponsors and ideologies of this global jihad and its regional incarnations. We know that there are money and there are ideas behind these jihadist wars. These people live in Muslim, in key Muslim countries, in Sunni countries, and usually we do not name them not to make anybody nervous and not to be politically incorrect. But in a few countries, in a few Sunni countries, there is a very strange symbiosis between official governments who do not support terrorism and various foundations and members of the royal families who actually do support it unofficially. And we can do very little about this symbiosis. So what broader conclusion we may make on these points? The broader conclusion is that because in the last 40 years we've always had at least 1 or 2 regional jihadist conflicts, it's very likely that we are not able to defeat them in any single conflict. If they meet enough resistance, the conflict just shifts to another place. So what then I suppose on the basis of this is that Russia and the United States could unite their forces in the previous decade when it was more about the job to defeat somebody, to defeat Al-Qaeda, for example. But when it comes to the point what to do about this always existing jihadist threat and about actually agreeing where a new jihadist war will start, for example, if it finishes in Afghanistan, then the core jihadist fighters will move to some other territory. They will not just disappear from somewhere. They will move to another Muslim country where they see local vulnerabilities to exploit them and to make a new civil war. And what we cannot agree between Russia and the United States, we cannot agree when it comes to the periods when a certain conflict comes close to an end, and fighters become going to other places. And then we cannot agree what to do with this period between one active jihadist conflict finishing and another jihadist conflict starting to appear somewhere. And also, I would draw your attention to the fact that in the last decade, when Russia and the United States were very much in the agreement on the war on terror, We were in such agreement when Russia and the United States were still in the phase of disengaging from regional conflicts. However, in this decade, we see already in the end of last decade and also in this decade, we see that Russia and the United States are more active in various regions of the world. And based on this, I am not sure that we are doomed to fight together international terrorists and jihadist movements. I think that we are very close to trying to exploit them against each other in regional conflicts. And partly that is already happening in Afghanistan, and I will just mention one regional example in this case. We see that in the last 5 years, the most radical and the most extremist elements, terrorist elements in Afghanistan, were moving from the territories where they were traditionally located, in the south of the country, to the northern territories of Afghanistan, bordering Central Asian countries, including the Russian formal ally Tajikistan, with whom we are jointly members of the Common Defense Organization and CSTO. And in Russia, there is a lot of suspicion that this movement of radical elements closer to the Russian borders is not something happening spontaneously, but there is a more or less organized and coordinated policy of the local government, its international allies, and more or less moderate terrorist elements on the Afghan territory who are moving toward the territories of Central Asia where they may be allowed to open a new front. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Safranchuk. And then we have about 25 minutes for Q&A, so I suggest you introduce yourself before asking your question. Please.
Thank you very much for your very insightful remarks. My name is Daria Kim. I'm a first-year master's student here at MGIMO. And my question would be for Professor TOFT, and it concerns dealing with international terrorism in the scope of international criminal justice. So you know that there are cases, human rights cases, accusing ISIS of genocide. Specifically, there's one that represents a Yazidi woman who was one of the few people who survived an ISIS attack. According to international lawyers and human rights lawyers, many victims of these crimes would actually like to see justice happen in international court rather than just have ISIS fighters eliminated, as many suggest. And you have mentioned that the U.S. strongly considers ISIS war criminals. However, unfortunately, little has been done within the framework of the UN. As far as I know, no special tribunals have been established to consider these kinds of cases. And so my question is, do you think that this dimension really exists in dealing with ISIS specifically and in combating terrorism in general? And do you think that having ISIS fighters receive a verdict and being convicted in an international court is actually a feasible way of dealing with this problem? Thank you very much.
Yes, so there hasn't been a lot of progress in that direction, in part because the focus right now is in defeating ISIS, which we're doing. But I think you will see some movement to try and, the Syrian Observatory Group that I mentioned, one of their jobs is collecting data, and not only against the Yazidis, but others, Christians as well, in the region. And they have pretty good evidence of intent of genocide, right? And why they're doing that is they'd like to bring them before some sort of international tribunal tribunal, criminal court. But at this point, it's really been about defeating them, and then I think later you'll get to a sense of how to bring about justice for the victims of that. But we're not there yet. And that would require, I think there is consensus on doing that across, the different parties in the conflict, but there are international lawyers in the room, Diana, to talk about these kinds of issues. It's going to be very difficult to coordinate and coalesce to do that. But I think if of any entity or agent that you can do it against, ISIS indeed, because I think there is consensus that what they did was of such barbaric nature and of genocidal proportions that you could do it. The question is who's going to herald that fight, who's going to help do it. And I think others in the room might be better positioned to talk about who would be best positioned to do that.
Any quick remarks to other panelists? So, yes.
My name is Maxim Harkovich. I teach here, and I have some questions for Professor Tuft and Professor Safranchuk. The first question is about religion. How easy it is to distinguish religious civil wars from just civil wars? Like a methodological question. And another thing is, what do you think about the idea that Islam as a religion needs its kind of reformation, as happened to Christianity, to become more moderate and peaceful? And the question for Ivan Alexeyevich, that core fighters, what do you see? They behave, what the dominant logic of their behavior? Is it geopolitics? Is it economics, like private military companies? Or is it religion, crusaders, and so on? And is there any dynamics in, maybe they started as, crusaders, and now more like private military companies? Thank you.
So maybe I'll go back to that slide on religion. So how I think about it, and if anybody's interested in the data, I'll share them. They're mine. Is thinking through whether the combatants themselves abide by different religious traditions. So you can think about the wars in former Yugoslavia, where you had Catholic Croats fighting Orthodox Serbs, fighting Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims, and they weren't fighting over religion dominating the state or as part of sort of the governance of the state. But the combatants allied across different sides. It determined or to influence, not completely determine, influence who your enemy was going to be and who you would be fighting for. So that, in those cases, religion is peripheral to the fight. It's not core, it's not central. But in other cases, religion is quite central. In the first case of it in the post-Cold War era was Tajikistan, right, where you had former communists, secular fighters, fighting against people who really wanted to impose Sharia law on the broader part of the state. And again, you see that in Syria, where you have some of the fighters wanting to have a more Sharia-dominated kind of law, determining politics, basically, being part of the policy. So there, in those cases, religion is quite central. And if you look at religiously inspired civil wars, it's split between those that are peripheral and those where religion is central. And in the more modern contemporary era, where it's central, it tends to engage Muslim societies, Muslim-majority societies, but not always. But for the most part. And then in terms of a reformation, is it needed for Islam? I mean, I think one of the things what I really try to impress in my own writings is that it's not Islam itself. You know, this is mediated and interpreted through human action and particularly brought into the policy arena, instrumentalized. And right now, as I mentioned, one of the laws of political science, there's two laws. One is democratic states tend not to go to war with other democratic states. It's not that they don't go to war, they just don't go to war with other democratic states. And another law is that the most worrisome states, if you're thinking about the probability of going to civil war, are states that are not purely democratic and states that are not purely autocratic. It's those in-between anocracies. And if you look at what's happening in the Arab world in particular, but you can look across the Muslim world, is you're having a movement from autocracies. This is what the Arab Spring was about, right? Where populations were trying trying to hold their governments accountable and be more transparent. And then you had this instrumentalization, right, the bringing of religion as a way to mobilize parts of the electorate. You saw this happening in Iraq. You saw it in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood. And they basically overplayed their hand and got tossed out. Tunisia, it was a real struggle, the degree to which Islam was going to be part of the constitution, and they sort of backtracked. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a reformation. What you need is a reinterpretation, a moderate interpretation of Islam, and for those moderate voices to have a larger say both in the political arena and then in terms of policy.
Thank you for very thought-stimulating questions. First, I would say that human beings, they sometimes do, but usually they do not fight without ideas. They do not fight without ideas at all. So we somehow tend to justify what we do. Even the most bad guys of us, we still somehow justify what we're doing, particularly if we use force, which other criticize. And that's why in any conflict, some ideas and non-material rationale for a conflict emerges. And in traditional societies, religion inevitably becomes an important part of this non-material rationale for use of violence and force. Then there may be competing narratives of this non-material ration, maybe even competing narratives of within the same religion explanation. But religion inevitably emerges as an important part of justification of use of force in civil wars in traditional societies, which are most of the Muslim countries. That's why to distinguish really in most of the developing countries just civil war, as you said, from religious civil war is impossible. I would say that religious civil war per se are non-existent so far, at least now and in the recent decades. But all civil wars which are existent have a strong religious element inside it, at least one faction and so on. And then why such faction becomes very strong? Because in Islam, moderate voices, because it's not reformed, there was no reformation, and the general rule is very simple. The most radical is the most right. The most fundamental, more correctly, not radical, the most fundamental. The closer you are to the original text, the righter you are for the uneducated masses and so on. And that is just the reality which makes a religious component very strong in civil wars in traditional Muslim societies. Even if the conflict started on something else, it evolves to have this non-material, usually religious element. And I'm very skeptical about the possibility of reformation in the Muslim world. This thesis has been in the literature already for at least 2 decades. Even generalists like Kissinger mentioned it already over a decade ago that reformation is needed for Islam. But I think that Islam is very different in some important characters from Christianity, and the Reformation, like in Christianity, is impossible in the same way in Islam. Then, what is the motivation of the co-fighters of jihad? To make the story simpler, I would compare them to the professional revolutionary movements of the first half of the 20th century. So, Communist International. What was it? Was it about money? Was it about ideas? Was it just about professional courage for some? They wanted to do it because they believed it right, but also because it was something special. It was giving you a career opportunity. It was giving you an opportunity to shift from a dirty worker to somebody who is making history. So I think that is the motivations of these core jihadist fighters is comparable with the international, with the Communist International 100 years ago, and everything is mixed there. Money, adventurism, individual adventurism, but ideas are very important. Ideas are something what puts all that together and make them very, very consistent in their doings.
Let me add a couple of words, though the question wasn't put to me. But I would like to point out that in the Arab world, for example, and not only, there are leaders who realize that the form of Islam which exists in their states is a real obstacle to the modernization and even to the rulers themselves. And if you take, for example, Mohammed bin Salman, who, as you know, believes that under the Prophet Muhammad, the social situation, and especially the situation of the women in Islam, was quite different. So he also insists that there should be changes, and not only concerning women, but in a wide social sense of this word. And I can also mention Sisi, who had very famous speech at Al-Azhar, saying just what you have just said, actually. So that it's absolutely a medieval situation, that we need changes, things like that. So I would say that in the Muslim world, there are a lot of people who realize that certain changes should be introduced. But as far as terrorist organizations are concerned, and first and foremost ISIS, you know, they are not so much about religious ideas as such. They are fighting for justice, first and foremost. And for those people who join the ranks of ISIS, it's a mission. You know, they live in not very just world. You know, well, they can be really very much dissatisfied with the states in which they live, with the rulers who really do not know what is justice about. And for them, it's a sort of protest movement as well. It doesn't mean that they come to fight for money. Some of them do. But at the same time, there are many people who come and bring money, their own money, to support the cause of ISIS. And that is why it is dangerous, you know. Its ideology is dangerous because it's very difficult to fight it. I mean, ideologically, not just on the ground, but ideologically. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we collect a couple of questions? So you go first, and then Christopher Miller, and then if there's another question, then we'll lump three together.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor TOFT. Do you think that the United States is feeling that they're losing their kind of hegemony, specifically in the region, because in Syria, specifically in the kind of lessening of the importance of FSA, the Free Syrian Army? And also, do you believe that this is kind of like a proud, like maybe a motor or motivation for the U.S. to kind of ramp up their involvement in the area? And also, it seems that the East is looking for a political resolution to this, and you hear this whole time in your UN Security Council being spoken about finding political solution, and it seems that the U.S. always offers only no-fly zones, which just ends up increasing the insurgencies and kind of actually increases the conflicts, it seems. So what is your opinion on this? And also opinion on Saudi Arabia and the United States kind of turning a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's connections to al-Nusra and actually funding that terrorist organization. Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself?
I am Alexandra. I'm actually an international student from the United States.
Okay, thanks. Professor Miller?
I'd be interested to hear the panelists.
Could you just wait for the mic? It's coming from behind.
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Miller from the Fletcher School. I'd be interested to hear the panelists reflect on the relationship between the U.S. and Russia and the other parties they're working with in Syria. And in particular, I'd be interested to hear more about the extent to which the U.S. and Russia are able to shape the behavior or restrain the behavior of their allies. So, for example, to what extent can the United States constrain the behavior of the Kurdish militias in Syria, or to what extent can Russia shape or restrain the behavior of either the Assad government or Iran within Syria?
So we have time for addressing those questions and whatever concluding remarks you would like to make.
So should I start? So Alexander, great questions. I think the United States is still trying to formulate its policy, its longer-term policy, that I think it understands that it's sort of at a standstill, trying to figure out what to do with Syria and resolve it. And as I said, particularly under the Trump administration, the concern about the war spreading, yes, we've curtailed and cut back on IS, but fighters are moving into Libya more so, Afghanistan, the Far East, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Philippines, and then, of course, into Yemen. And the United States is quite concerned about Yemen, which is why you're seeing it was one of the first operations that the Trump administration did last year, and it's continuing. So I think it's still trying to come to terms with what the end game is going to be in Yemen, and as I mentioned, perhaps accepting that Assad is at least, at a minimum, going to be part of the negotiations to any peace or suing a peace for the country. But beyond that, we'll see what the negotiations bring. And then with Saudi Arabia and turning a blind eye, yeah, I mean, I somewhat jest about this, but the United States has this thing called Iran hostage-itis, where we have not gotten over the 1979 hostage crisis. That's one of the reasons why I think the conservative right, and particularly in the country, wanted to turn back the Iranian deal, which was actually a pretty good deal, and evidence seemed to indicate that Iran was abiding by that deal, but as we know, the United States says, nope, we're not going to accept it any longer. And I think it's this hangover effect from 1979. And so long as the Saudis are seen, they were given, in part under the Obama administration, to get the Iran deal, the Saudis were given a freer hand in the Middle East, and we're now paying the consequences of that. And so long as the Saudis commit themselves to fighting the Iranians, and again, we've got a regional balance of power fight happening, that the United States is being drawn in, but so is Russia. And so if Russia and the United States could understand that and have a conversation about, okay, how do we not get further drawn in, that would be a positive step, and really understanding that regional balance of power and how the locals draw us in. This is sort of to Chris's point, Professor Miller's point, how the locals draw us in and end up fighting a fight that implicates us more and actually doesn't advance our interests. And then Chris, on the U.S. and controlling the parties, of course not. I mean, this is the problem of allies being drawn in and then having to do their bidding and working with them, and it's quite difficult to control allies and working at cross purposes. And it's not clear that, ideally the United States would like stability in the region, but when you've got the Saudis sort of perpetrating actually a major conflict now in Yemen, that the United States has sort of been dragged in, and then the concern, of course, and Russia looking at Iran, and of course Iran would love to draw the Saudis further into Yemen so that it could have a freer hand in northern Syria, so that it can then clear its way to maintain its corridor through Lebanon. So these proxy wars that we're helping to fight are further destabilizing the region, and if we could all just sort of take a breath, step back and say, okay, how can we bring about, but again, competing interests both globally, but then regionally and at the localities. So this is a messy one, and I don't think it's going to get better. And what's so tragic, of course, is now we're moving into a second generation of societies that have no medical, no transport, no education, and the recovery from that is going to be pretty profound.
Thank you.
I think that 5 years ago we had less control of great powers over regional players than now, and that's why I would say that regional players very much contributed to drawing Russia and the United States into the Syrian conflict, at least in this confrontational mode. So 5-7 years ago, we had really a problem of regional players manipulating the regional agenda. Now it is less so, but not because we have more control over them. But as I think Monica rightly said, there is some convergence of purposes. There are crossing purposes, and that's why sometimes Russia and Saudi purposes coincide, and even if we do not coordinate something, we move in the same direction. Sometimes American-Saudi causes also overlap, their purposes overlap, and then you also do something, not together, but more or less individually, but in the same direction. That is not exactly control, but that is less mess because of these overlapping purposes. And I think that we are unlikely to move forward to make it even better when we have more control. Why? Because neither Russia nor the United States want to take full responsibility for these regional conflicts. And that's why this gray zone, where we do not fully lose control like it was 5-7 years ago, and we do not take fully responsibility, and for that purposes disciplining our allies and friends, we are so far not comfortable in this gray zone from the technical perspective. Because our secret services and mercenaries are involved in various types of messes. But in broader political terms, we are comfortable with this gray zone. And to put it bluntly, for presidents, that is fine. If this is a problem for professionals on the ground, that is just their job to do something despite these problems existing. That's why I think the guideline from the top political level will be, that's fine, not fully losing control to regional players and not fully taking responsibility and disciplining these players.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I would agree with what my colleagues have already said. I would just add something concerning Syria, for example, because we do understand that we have certain limits. When we try to contain our allies or quasi-allies, sometimes they call themselves allies and we do not necessarily recognize it. But anyway, we do have certain limitations and we will live with them. At the same time, there is a good news as well, because if we still believe that the peace process is possible, that the Geneva process should be revived, then there is reason to bring these people to the negotiation table and to put certain pressure both on the opposition and on the Assad government. But in the absence of political process, the reason for pressing them has been evaporating, you know. That is why our opportunity of putting pressure upon them, of disciplining them, is very situational. We can do it, but only under certain well-known circumstances.
Okay, so before we conclude this panel, I have two announcements to make. First, if anyone needs simultaneous translation, not only from English into Russian, but also from Russian into English, and you still don't have a headset, please let the organizers know, and they will be able to give you one. And secondly, once we conclude, without any break, I invite the next panel to take their seats: Alexander Velykzhanin, Anatoly Kapustin, Joel Trechman, and Mikhail Lysenko. And now, please join me in thanking our fascinating panel, which finished it on time.